although at the time I didn't realize what was happening. I was unable to make a decision that might displease those around me. For years, whatever directive I may have issued ended with the phrase, "If it's all right with you." If I thought I'd done anything to make someone unhappy, I'd agonize. One of my principal childhood memories is hearing one of the Liszt Hungarian rhapsodies wafted throughout the house. To love what you do and feel that it matters, how could anything be more fun? Family ownership provides the independence that is sometimes required to withstand governmental pressure and preserve freedom of the press. Once, power was considered a masculine attribute. In fact, power has no sex. If one is rich and one's a woman, one can be quite misunderstood. The press these days should be rather careful about its role. We may have acquired some tendencies about over-involvement that we had better overcome. In large families, it seems it is hardest to be either the first or the last child. That was certainly true in ours. Being a woman in control of the company, even a small private company, as ours was then, was so singular and surprising in those days that I necessarily stood out. In 1963, and for the first several years of my working life, my situation was certainly unique. Mountain climbing was one of Mother's favorite occupations, but she never succeeded in inculcating this passion in any of us. I believed and believe that capitalism works best for a freedom-loving society, that it brings more prosperity to more people than any other social economic system, but that somehow we have to take care of people. In my first year, or so at the Post, I began to write with some frequency on the least important issues, so-called light editorials. The titles themselves are revealing of just how light. On being a horse, brains and beauty, mixed drinks, Lou Gehrig, and spotted fever. I didn't really want deadlines and editorial work. I wanted something mechanical, and 8 hours a day. So I went to work, thinking it was easy, on the complaint desk at the circulation department. To me, involvement with news is absolutely inebriating. It's what makes my life exciting. When it comes to Washington, most people tend to think first of politics. But Washington is also a geographic and physical place. It is, for instance, one of the few cities in the world where you can talk endlessly about trees. Dean Acheson was one of the very best and brightest of the men who ever came to Washington. Alice Roosevelt Longworth was only a few years older than my mother, but outlived her by a decade, dying in 1980 from the time they met. In 1917, they were lifelong friends of sorts, though each was a bit wary of the other. I remember the Washington in which I grew up as a genuine small town. Maybe this is true for everyone, that we all feel that the times in which we grew up were simpler, less complex. I adopted the assumption of many of my generation that women were intellectually inferior to men, that we were not capable of governing, leading, and managing anything but our homes and our children. The organization that I joined when I went to work, the trade association called the Bureau of Advertising, became the first of many over the years in which I was the only woman. When in 1969, I became publisher of the Washington Post, as well as president of the company, my plate was fuller than ever. I had partly worked myself into the job, but not, except for rare occasions, taken hold. I had acquired some sense of business, but still relied on others more than most company presidents did. The image of me as someone who likes or can deal with a fight is wrong. Some people enjoy competition and dust-ups, and I wish I did, but I don't. But once you have started down a path, then I think you have to move forward. You can't give up. My mother seemed to undermine so much of what I did, subtly belittling my choices and my activities in light of her greater, more important ones. I truly believed that other people in my position didn't make mistakes. I couldn't see that everybody makes them, even people with a great experience. It took me a while to learn that certain people may have important skills that are not always blazingly apparent. Gradually, I came to realize, slow as I may have been, that what mattered was performance, that sometimes people might have to be helped to develop, and that it takes all kinds to make an organization run properly. No one can avoid aging, but aging productively is something else. There are some things the general public does not need to know, and shouldn't. I believe democracy flourishes when the government can take legitimate steps to keep its secrets, and when the press can decide whether to print what it knows. Others set impossibly high standards for us, creating tremendous pressures and undermining our ability to accomplish whatever modest aims we may have set for ourselves. A mistake is simply another way of doing things. If we had failed to pursue the facts as far as they led, we would have denied the public any knowledge of an unprecedented scheme of political surveillance and sabotage. So few grown women like their lives. Atomic school proved to be my first big adjustment, one that helped me with a basic lesson of growing up, learning to get along in whatever world one is deposited. There have been 2 periods in my lifetime when the excitement of government and of public issues drew to Washington many of the bright young people graduating from colleges and law schools. These were essentially the Roosevelt and the Kennedy years. Those first few years of marriage, before the war interrupted all our lives, Phil and I had a very happy time. I grew up considerably, mostly thanks to him. My position in the family turned out to be a lucky one. I bore neither the brunt of my mother's newness to parenthood nor the force of her middle-aged traumas, as my younger sister, Ruth, did. For more than 8 decades, Washington has been my hometown. My whole orientation is toward this place. I love Martha's Vineyard, where I have had a house for 30 years. I have loved visiting countries around the world, but I always come home to Washington. The thing women must do to rise to power is to redefine their femininity. Once, power was considered a masculine attribute. In fact, power has no sex. There seems to be nothing very bad about a nation's capital having good intentions, and when the intentions are magnificent, so much the better. One doesn't soon forget the natural beauty of Washington, although those of us who live here do sometimes take it for granted. I always liked Barbara Howard and admired her spunk. I know that she considered me an Alice Roosevelt Longworth, an exception to her negative feelings about Washington widows and single women, whom she basically found dispensable. At least through most of the 1960s, I'd basically lived in a man's world, hardly speaking to a woman all day except to the secretaries. But I was almost totally unaware of myself as an oddity, and had no comprehension of the difficulties faced by working women in our organization and elsewhere.